Coastal Front welcomes Sam Lee, President and CEO of Northisle Copper and Gold. Northisle is a Vancouver-based junior resource company committed to the development of copper and gold exploration projects on Vancouver Island just south of Port Hardy. The company portfolio consists of 2 advanced stage deposits with current NI 43101 resources and 2 early stage deposits spanning across 33,000 hectares of mineral claims. With strong tailwinds in the global copper market, a small TSX venture company like this can't go wrong with Sam Lee. Sam holds a Bachelor of Applied Science from the Faculty of Engineering at the University of Toronto. He's a graduate of the Lassonde Mineral Engineering Program, and he's a CFA charter holder. Before joining Northisle Copper and Gold in October of 2020, Sam spent nearly 20 years as an investment banker, with his last position as managing director of CIBC World Markets and their global mining group. So Sam, thanks for being on the show today.
You're most welcome, Andrew. Pleasure to be here.
Okay, Sam, so I'm really pumped to have you here. We've known each other on a friendly basis. Our families have known each other for a few years.
Yep.
And I was really excited when I saw you pivot from being an investment banker, which is generally for most people, I'm sure for you, a pretty great job to have. You would have been very good at that role. So to make that jump to being a CEO of a public company, there must have been something behind Northisle Copper that got you excited about being there. So why don't we start with that? What was it that brought you to want to become the CEO of a public company and exit 20 years of being an investment banker?
Absolutely. Well, as all professions, you're always looking for substance and purpose. And certainly banking has been such a transactional endeavor for me, and it's been quite a successful endeavor for me. You know, working on over $100 billion of M&A deals during those 20 years, seeing the precipice of cycles starting and ending during those 20 years, being able to recognize those points in the cycle, and then attaching yourself to an asset and a group of people that can bring that asset into fruition is something that is tremendously impactful and exciting for me. To have the purpose of being able to build something that is going to be meaningful, material, and very relevant with respect to what this world needs today, but also with respect to our communities. This asset literally is in our backyard. It's something that we have a responsibility, a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that there is prosperity for all that are involved.
Okay, well, that's good. That's a good starting point. When I look at successful exploration companies, and of course, Vancouver's a hotbed for mining, our country is, you highlighted about team, and there's really 2 big things that have to happen. You have to have obviously a great resource, you have to have good discoveries, and you have to have a really good team. So did you bring in your own team to Northisle Copper? Did you become part of a team? What drew, or was it the asset itself? Mm-hmm. and the project? What was it that kind of really brought you in the first point?
Sure, absolutely. Well, as I said, team and asset. So our chairman, Dale Corbin, who actually just got inducted into the Canadian Mining Hall of Fame, is best known for developing an asset called Penasquito, bringing it into the feasibility stage, and then selling it to Glamis Gold Corp for $1.2 billion. He also is the founder of a company called Western Copper, and of course, the founder of Northisle Copper and Gold. And so he's a gentleman who's been around for many, many decades. He's seen 8 to 10 of these types of cycles. He's an incredible consigliere for me. He's obviously an invaluable chairman with someone that can provide great direction and someone that I trust completely. So it starts from there.
Okay.
The second part of it is recognizing, as I said, where we are in any point of the cycle. And certainly, this project here is a very large copper and gold project with approximately 5 billion pounds of copper equivalent.
Wow.
And within that distribution, it's approximately 64% copper and about 33% gold. And so these are commodities in my mind that are exceedingly relevant in the future of our world, certainly through electrification, through carbon neutrality, carbon net zero, decarbonization. You can't do any of that without copper.
Okay.
So,
we are going to spend some time talking about why it's relevant. Just to go back to your 5 billion pounds of copper, can you give the listeners a context of what that means? I mean, it sounds like a big number.
Sure.
Is it a big number?
It is a very big number, and it's reflective and is really the underpinning value of our company, which is defined currently by a preliminary economic study. So this is a engineering study that is within the 43101 context. It's obviously a regulatory framework that recognizes this as being a preliminary economic study, and it yields about $1.1 billion in net present value,
Wow.
net present value 8 after tax.
Mm-hmm.
That's done obviously at a $3.25 copper price environment and $16.50 gold. We're well beyond those levels today.
Okay.
So for me, being
So quite a bit lower than where the market's at right now.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's something that clearly we can talk about shortly.
Yeah.
What is driving the prices going to levels that we haven't seen, quite frankly, since 2011. But the reality is based on very conservative pricings that, again, is at $3.25 copper, $16.50 gold. This project is a very, very significant project.
So the project is on North Vancouver Island. I grew up in Port Alberni,
That's
so
right.
it's in my kind of backyard. I used
That's
to
right.
play hockey. We've got a hockey background, both of us. I used
Yes.
to play a lot of games up there.
Indeed.
Tough kids up in Hardy
Absolutely.
and other areas around there. So can you give us a description of the main? I mentioned in our intro, there's 2 advanced stage deposits and then 2 early stage deposits. Do you want to kind of quickly name those and what they mean?
Sure. So the preliminary economic study, the one that yields a $1.1 billion value, is comprised of Hushima and Red Dog. And so these projects are approximately a 30 to 40 minute drive on a mostly paved road from Port Hardy, which I think people don't recognize how important infrastructure plays in the development of a project. And in our case, we are approximately 25 kilometers away from already a deep sea water port. It was used by BHP for a project called Island Copper. It's arguably one of the closest, if not the closest, deep sea water port from continental America to Japan, which is where they sold their concentrate to Sumitomo. It's a very high purity concentrate, low deleterious elements. So if you ever hear Robert Friedland talk about premium concentrates, and he's talking about stratification of multiple 3, 4, 5, up to 20 premiums, this would be one of the highest premium concentrates because it does have low arsenic and low deleterious elements as identified through the contracts that BHP had with Sumitomo. Okay. So you have that only about 25 kilometers away. We share the land.
This is a mine that BHP had. It's been closed subsequently.
Correct.
Right? So they've mined it.
They've mined it out.
Okay.
It was approximately the same size, a little bit smaller than what we're contemplating today.
Wow.
They used Port Hardy as their epicenter to house over 500 direct workers, over 1,000, 2,000 indirect workers.
Yeah.
So there is no need for a camp. These workers literally drove about half an hour on a nicely paved road to work every day, which obviously is significant as it relates to cutting down on your costs.
Yeah. Do you remember what years they were mining there?
Yeah, it was in the 70s up to 1995.
Yeah, that makes sense because growing up in Port Alberni, one of the things I recall was that Port Hardy had all the resources we had in Port Alberni of fishing and logging, but they also had mining. I just didn't know what it was. So those are your the 2 big projects, the Red Dog and
Hushima.
That's
right.
You also have 2 other projects.
Yep.
Do you want to spend a minute to talk about those?
What we have in one of our satellite deposits, which is only about 3 kilometers away, we've released this a couple of months ago, is an area called Northwest Expo that has what we believe is approximately 40 to 50 million tons of incremental mineralization, which we are setting out to define within the 43101 context this year. So that's quite significant. It's got higher grades, approximately 4 to 5 times higher gold grades than what we currently have in our resources, and all of it would be incremental. The second asset we have is Pemberton Hills, which we had a joint venture with Freeport, and this is really the elephant hunting prospect, which is between our asset and the BHP asset. And so this is going to be, obviously, very early days, but what we see today is an enormous system that spans approximately 6 kilometers and 1 kilometer deep of a lithocap, which is typically a structure in geology that caps large porphyry systems. And so what we found thus far with the help of Freeport is that it's big, it's massive, and it's deep. Which isn't necessarily good. So we've now come to grips with a theory that predicts that we can intercept the porphyry at a shallower distance because we believe that the system is tilted towards a valley. So that's the work that we're going to be doing this year around Pemberton Hills, in addition to advancing our project and also defining an additional 43-101 resource on Northwest Expo.
So for those listeners who may not be familiar with the exploration process behind mining, there are essentially 7 stages in the life of a mine, 4 of which are what are referred to as pre-production. So there's exploration, evaluation, feasibility, and development. Sam, can you maybe comment, just to be really abundantly clear in layman's terms, where these 2 projects fit in that stage?
So the stages are essentially exploration, which we've obviously conducted, and we've found the resource base. And the preliminary economic study, which we've completed last year, is the first of 3, typically, economic evaluations. And so it goes through preliminary economic assessment, through preliminary feasibility study, and then feasibility study.
Okay.
And so through these stage gates, typically what happens is companies tend to re-rate. As they de-risk, there's more confidence around the engineering and the resource definition, that there is a stronger belief and stronger appreciation towards your intrinsic value, which is typically defined by your net present values. So it's one of these situations where we are in the market today really does require that thought leadership, and that we have a good cornerstone base. We're amassing that sponsorship currently. Where things get really interesting, though, is when you get into that 4th to 9th inning, and that would have been based on the last cycle, circa 2006 to 2011. But obviously, but for the global financial crisis, which was probably about a 1-year disruption for at least the copper side of it. And that's when we saw valuations go absolutely through the roof. There was an insatiable...
This was the commodity super cycle you're referring to.
It is a commodity super cycle. And I think the more important thing is that it really, at least from the copper space, this is where I saw the majority of my, $100 billion of M&A transactions. Within that time, you really did see some very non-traditional players coming in for these assets because they needed to get their hands on products. So it's not just the strategics, it's the traders, the off-takers, the smelters who are just looking to secure offtakes. We saw obviously the royalty companies coming in for the precious metal products. We saw a tremendous amount of strategic activity. So fast forward to today, what are we seeing in some similarities? Well, China is not growing at 11.5% GDP growth, which was probably one of the exclusive drivers for the last super cycle. But we are seeing that electrification narrative. We are seeing the decarbonization, which effectively means the rest of the world is looking to do exactly what China was doing over the last cycle, which is, China was urbanizing, which means electrifying, right? The rest of the world is really at that position where they're now picking up that growth initiative and that insatiable need. Of course, with other economic drivers and stimuluses, including the Biden administration's infusion of $3 trillion into the building new infrastructure, that just exasperates the need for commodities such as copper.
Well, Sam, that's a great segue into talking about how copper fits into the whole sort of global economy. I'm going to start with a couple of fun copper facts. Get this thing really interesting. So first of all, a megawatt project that's being powered by solar panels, for every 1 megawatt of solar power panels that you want to have run to generate electricity, and to power a home with a megawatt gives you about a month and a half of power for a home. You need 5.5 tons of copper for one of those projects. One of those wind turbines that you see and out in the farmers' fields, each one of those require almost 1,000 pounds of copper to kind of generate the electricity that they need to generate. And the last one I think will really sink in for people here as we see more and more people moving to electric cars from gas-powered cars. Today, a gas-powered car takes about anywhere from 20 to 50 pounds of copper, depending on the type of car, to produce that car. An electric car takes almost 200 pounds of copper. So just that alone gives a sense of this massive, insatiable demand for copper. So laying you up for that, tell me a bit more about what you know about copper on a global scale. And let's talk maybe about supply and demand.
Absolutely. Well, you stole my thesis right there, but extremely accurate and correct. And as I said, every cycle has different themes, right? The theme certainly circa 2001 to 2011 was China. China growth, China urbanization, China electrification. That has obviously subsided to some extent, and probably more so now given what's happening with COVID. But what has replaced that thematic is the electrification of the rest of the world, as I mentioned before. Mm-hmm. And so all of those stats really, whether you believe in the decarbonization, model or the executability of it, the ship has really sailed on government's policies and overall acceptance in the world that this thing is going to happen, right? So you mentioned that it takes 4 to 5 times more copper to produce an electric vehicle than an internal combustion vehicle. Well, governments around the world have committed to having 40 to 50% of electric vehicles on the road by 2050.
Yeah.
Right. So this is really happening. If you go to the school that your kids go to the school that my kids go to, electric vehicles are already pretty much at that 40 to 50% level. Right. Mm-hmm. So I think it's really important for people to understand that it's not only the electrification as it relates to batteries, but it's also the battery storage, its transmission. Copper is the most malleable and certainly the most conductive metal that we know of within a reasonable price range. And so that continuation of, the electrification motif that we saw in the turn of last decade is certainly going to be a prominent factor moving forward. Now, on the supply side, Goldman Sachs has called for approximately an 8 million ton deficit by 2030. So that's about 8 Escondidas, or for those that don't know how big Escondida, the world's largest copper mines, need to come online in 8 years of incremental production.
Wow.
Right? Things that haven't even been defined yet.
So Goldman Sachs has seen a deficit building over time. In short,
8 million tons.
8 million tons.
8 of the largest copper mines in the world.
Wow.
And so I can tell you with a great deal of certainty, it takes much longer than 8 years to forget about produce the copper, but to actually find it, develop it, permit it, and then go into production.
Production. Yeah.
So,
I think that's a really good point. Just pause for a second. I think it's a really good point for those listeners just to dumb this down. When you look at mining metals versus exploration of oil and gas, and one of the reasons the oil and gas companies out in prairies can get financing from the bank so quickly, and why the banks are willing to lend on those projects so early on, is because you drill some holes in the ground and you find some oil or some gas, you can extract it very, very fast. If Northisle Copper goes and finds some phenomenal deposits in the Port Hardy area, like you mentioned, all those stages you got to go through, environmental stakeholders you've got to partner with. It's a big project, requires a lot of capital. The end prize is huge, but it doesn't happen over 6 months or 18 months.
Correct. So to put that in context, in terms of a timeline, we're year 9 of what we believe is a 15-year process.
Wow.
So our modus operandi is to, well within this deficit period, 8-year deficit period, is to be in production, right? And very few projects today that are of similar stage can actually claim that. So I think, if you think about what is going to facilitate this need for the 8 to 10 million ton deficit, it's going to come from 3 sources, in my opinion, right? It's going to come from recycling. It's going to come from technology disruption, and most prevalent of which is probably hydrometallurgy, which is essentially leaching existing waste dumps for its copper product. And it's going to be...
Like literally pulling copper out of a landfill.
Correct. Or a tailings deposit.
Right.
And then lastly, I think it's going to come from incremental deposits like ourselves. We are not an Escondida. We don't have We're not purporting to produce a million tons a year. But I think that it's an all hands on deck.
Yeah.
If you believe in that 8 to 10 million ton deficit, everything needs to come online. And who is going to be, first past the post in this situation? And I truly believe the second thesis and narrative as it relates to this cycle versus last is the social license aspect of actually getting a project moving ahead is critical. And what BC has done over the last few decades, is really has established a very strong framework for that permitting process.
Well, this is a really good point. I mean, just to give you some reflection on this, as a kid who grew up in Port Alberni, very close to where your project is at, and we moved there in 1976. And I grew up there as a kid observing an environment that, it was a huge growth community until, of course, the recession hit in the early 1980s. But even after that, the resource sectors of logging and fisheries was huge. And of course, I said earlier, mining up in the northern part of the island. And the approach back then was very simple. You had a bunch of white guys like me, Asian Canadians like you. It was just a bunch of white guys in a boardroom in Vancouver who just hit the go button and they mowed over everybody. Environmentalists, local stakeholders, First Nations were never even a consideration. And they just reaped the profits and lined their pockets. And so what's refreshing for me to see is guys like you coming into this environment and recognizing the importance of having all those stakeholders, those local stakeholders. And it is there to create jobs and to create wealth for those different communities.
And, we've been obviously in very close contact with Northisle and MLAs, with NDP party whips, with bureaucrats, with Ministry of Mines and Energy, and it all converges to the same thing. We're all on the same page, which is there needs to be an opportunity for prosperity in regions like the North Island. So there was one discussion that I had with a consortium of politicians and bureaucrats a few months ago. I IPO'd Pretium back in 2010. And for those that don't know, Pretium owns a project called the Brucejack deposit, which is in what's called the Golden Triangle.
So just to give context for the listeners, where's the Golden Triangle?
Sorry, Golden Triangle is in BC. And it was a historically very prolific golden egg,
up in the interior?
In the interior, in the northern part of British Columbia. And over the course, prior to 2010, over the course of 20 years, there was very little activity and very little prosperity. And Pretium, which had this very high-grade Brucejack deposit, deployed its capital, $50 million initially, and then over $1 billion over the course of 10 years, until just recently, until the point they just got purchased by Newcrest for billions of dollars. They put that into this project. So Pretium and Brucejack has opened up tremendous opportunities for the First Nation groups and the communities alike within that district. And my plea, and it was falling on very, very open ears, is that why don't we create a version 2.0 in the same province, just across the pond on the North Island of Vancouver?
Yeah, sure.
My belief is we have just as much mineral prospectivity there. We've got historical mining. We've got great infrastructure. We're able to reduce the footprint. We have supportive First Nation and communities group. We certainly have the history, the rich history of industrial activity on the island. We've got Deputy Minister of Mines, who's from Port Hardy. We've got a Premier whose constituents are in Port Hardy, on the North Island. This is a really... You've
got a port right by. You got 3 ports.
We've got 3 ports. And we've
Alice,
got
McNeil, and Hardy.
Exactly. So the infrastructure there, everything is aligned to conform to the momentum that we're seeing in this cycle around environmental sustainability, around social license, around First Nations empowerment, and around critical metals, copper of which being the most important critical metal, for which the Liberal government has already identified in multiple occasions as such. And so relevancy is so important in many different avenues. And
this highlights the environmental side. And I think this is one of the things I've noticed when I go to PDAC every year. Of course, there's always a group of people out front protesting with their iPhones, taking video of how nasty the mining industry is and mining companies. And that's why I do this podcast and have companies like you on here to say, look, the reality of life is in order for us to be able to live in this modern society, we have everything in this room to listen to this podcast. You have to have goods that were mined.
That's right.
And otherwise we all have to live in tents and under lean-tos. So when I look at that, I think, well, there are different types of mining companies in different jurisdictions.
Correct.
And in a similar theme to what I know the Canadian Conservative Party have been highlighting about how, ethical Canadian oil is versus oil from, say, Saudi Arabia or Russia. I mean, we have this amazing opportunity in this nation to provide an economic base for lots of people in small communities who don't have, a lot of job opportunities. And we can do it in an ethical way that's very transparent. I mean, as a public company, you just have to there's so much transparency about how you operate.
Absolutely.
And it's right in our backyard. So, I mean, I want to highlight something else just for listeners to really get the concept, because copper, if you talk to somebody about copper, it sounds kind of boring, right? I mean, you probably don't find you're the
not
CEO of a company. No, not for you.
Not.
But I mean, if you talk to somebody about gold or copper, gold just has a sort of sex appeal to it. But if you think about practically, from 2010 till 2020, so basically roughly around the last decade, worldwide use of copper has increased by 31% in a decade.
Yes.
Right? Now, you mentioned that Goldman Sachs quote of a deficit of, what was the number?
8 million tons a year.
8 million. And I know we've done our own research and expected that the one was by Rystad Energy, and they said around 6 million. So whether it's 6 or it's 8, this deficit has got to have a major impact on the price of copper. If you look at copper prices today, they're off their all-time highs, but only off by, they've gone from $5 to $4.15 or so, but they're way higher than they were before.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily reflect where things are going as well. Like, where is copper most used? Is it just broadly used in a whole bunch, or like when we talk about lithium, for example, like I know when we sat down with John Evans from Lithium Americas, it was really easy answer. He's like, basically it's used in batteries.
Correct.
It's batteries for your phone, batteries for your cars. Like that's the equation. But copper has a lot more common uses.
That's correct.
Is there any one, like if you looked at all the copper usage around the world, is it mostly electrification or the transfer of electricity from point A to point B? Is that what it is? Or?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. It's transmission. It's electric transmission at this point, right? But this emergence of battery, not only battery electric vehicles rather, but battery storage, which is becoming exceedingly more and more important as it relates to capacity, as it relates to even doing projects like ours in a remote area, right? This battery storage, instead of using perhaps a diesel genset, is going to be extremely important. So all of these components really add to the incremental need for copper. But historically, you're right. It has been more focused on infrastructure, building houses, obviously your copper wires and your copper pipes in your house. These are very important things. But on a relative basis, it is, I'd say, pales into comparison in terms of the growth prospects. In terms of, I saw your interview with John. I thought that was a wonderful interview.
Yeah, thanks.
And you asked a very good question.
He's a great guest.
And you asked the essential question, which is, what is the disruptive potential of moving away from lithium, cobalt, nickel generated batteries, or batteries that are that use these elements? And he had a very good answer for it, and which I absolutely agree with. But personally, I think that no matter what the battery chemistry you use, regardless if it's lithium or anything else, copper is the underlying commonality. You cannot replace the copper.
It's the pipeline.
It's the pipeline for it, right? And so that is what makes it.
Is it the easiest way to consider it? It's like Enbridge has this pipeline that runs sort of, we have pipelines all across North America, but it runs from Vancouver all the way out to the prairies. That's
right.
And so copper is the same thing, right? I mean, it's what runs that electricity from, your kettle from the, Site C Dam in the middle of BC.
That's correct. That's a great analogy. I might have to steal it from you at one point in time, but it's also the reason why people are saying perhaps copper can turn into the next oil as it relates to an economic indicator. We're at this precipice in the cycle where at one point, everybody is going to want to come in to the copper play. Off-takers, traders, smelters, royalty companies, gold companies, copper companies, base metal companies. We're starting to even see the Bezos, the Elon Musks taking very, very aggressive plays in the underlying commodities now, because they recognize that they can't build anything they want to build around sustainability and decarbonize without these essential critical metals.
Yeah.
We're seeing governments coming into play, identifying critical metal elements that they're giving subsidies for.
We're going to highlight that with the latest Trudeau budget.
Absolutely.
Okay, Sam, I want to go back to a couple of just sort of basic principles of copper. Now, for copper production, where it's made in the world. It's interesting, Canada being the hotbed of the mining sector, we have more mining companies that are publicly listed than anywhere else in the world between the TSX Venture. But Canada is actually ranked number 11th in the world on copper production. Mm-hmm. Where are the top 3 countries in the world? Where are those top countries producing copper? And is it pretty widespread, or is it very concentrated?
Yeah, it's a great question, because Canada was top 3, top 5 in the 70s and 80s when this Island copper mine was producing. And then what happened, there was this emergence.
Oh, really?
Yeah, no, Canada has always been a copper nation. In fact, even today, BC is Canada's largest copper producer. And of all the commodities, it's approximately 35% of total production, including met coal, including zinc, including other commodities, including gold. So BC copper has historically been extremely meaningful, but even today, when your statistic is entirely correct, it doesn't even crack the top 10 in the world. And that's because there was a tremendous amount of migration away back in the 70s and 80s and 90s as these South American companies led by Chile and Peru, and to some extent Argentina, started to really open up to the rest of the world for foreign investment. There's absolutely no doubt that they are a fruitful, incredibly prosperous geological area for copper. The land it's extremely conducive, outside of the fact they don't have as much fresh water as we have, but the mineral prospectivity is second to none, perhaps outside of Africa. I guess what the issue is today is that now we've seen some of that acceleration coming back to catch up with them around the social license that they have to mine these things,
right,
and the distribution of wealth across their societies.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing now...
Effectively, what you're saying is their mining activities today are kind of akin to what we saw 20, 30 years ago in Canada.
Correct.
And it's starting to bite them. I know the Lundins are really big on that social license that you're highlighting.
Yeah.
That's very important to them.
But it's also the distribution. It's not only just the social license, the environmental stewardship, it's also the distribution of wealth. How does a normal person actually see this, transpire into an equitable distribution of wealth, right? And so that's where Canada differs from
some of these
Latin
emerging
America,
nations, Latin America,
And so what we're now seeing is a little bit of frustration and disruption happening in the politics of these countries that I've mentioned, that is really scaring a lot of the larger incumbents to the extent, there's no way that they're going to exit the countries. We're obviously not seeing that happen.
Yeah.
But what they're doing is they're looking at coming back to copper producing nations that have strong infrastructure, good rule of law, good stable politics. And
do institutional investors care about this?
Absolutely. So absolutely, right? Because in the end, if you can't take it out of the ground, it's worth nothing.
Right. Good point.
Right. Or if you're getting taxed 75% above a certain price, then it's worth nothing to an investor.
Right.
Right. So I think there's definitely recognition, just by way of reference.
I'm going to pivot now to finish this off. I want to talk about flow through investing for a moment, and I'll make a couple of comments on this. So I'm not a big fan of I'm not a big, and this, I'm very open on this on social media around subsidizing businesses. I know recently the federal government, I think, did a big deal with GM to convert an Oshawa automobile plant to an EV plant, and taxpayers on the hook for couple $100 million when I think realistically GM would have write that check for themselves anyways, because that's where the market's going. But the one type of subsidy or sort of quasi subsidy is in the flow through space. I've seen it work over the last 20 years of my career, and it works like it's genius and it makes a lot of sense. So to simplify it, investors are incentivized to put their money into higher risk projects like Northisle copper and gold. Because it's an actual exploration play, without that support, it's going to be harder for you to attract, retail investor dollars. You might get the institutional money, but not so much by maybe retail investors. But if a retail investor who's a high income earner knows that they can get some money back through the taxes that they're already planning on paying anyways, it's not like they just get a check written to them. They have to be a high taxpayer through a flow through investment. Then it gets money into your pocket, and that money has to be spent on the exploration. It can't be used for marketing. It can't be used for you to go fly to New York to meet institutional investors. Like, you have to put that money in the ground, which actually is good for the economy. So I'm a big fan of flow through investing. Now, what's interesting is Justin Trudeau, who I'm not a huge fan of, but him and his Liberal Party have recently announced what they call, they define certain metals as critical minerals. And one of them is copper. And they've announced their critical mineral exploration tax credit as part of their 2022 budget. And this is providing a 30% tax credit on top of what you can get here locally in BC. So my team ran the math, and by our math, if you were a high income earner in British Columbia, investing in a project like Northisle copper and gold, if this gets passed, you're going to get back about 75 cents on the dollar in tax credits, assuming it's a super clean deal, there's no premium being paid, that kind of thing. I mean, flow throughs are a little bit complicated, but just to dumb it down, if you had $100,000, you're paying 53.5% tax in British Columbia, you'd get about $70,000 to $75,000 back on tax credits. To me, that's pretty interesting to see the federal government adding this sort of little extra bump in the tax credits that investors can get. It kind of tells you what they're seeing as well.
That's exactly right. And I think the significance and my takeaway of it is, well, to address your comment, I agree with you 100% as it relates to these subsidies. There are subsidies that are essentially put into the ground directly to find the minerals that are important to Canada, our society, jobs. I think over $500 million was spent in exploration alone last year in this province, right? So imagine how many jobs that provides. Imagine how many people that are employed at the assay labs, at the drillers, the contractors. So this is an absolute critical industry for Canada and BC, and I fully believe that's what makes us competitive, and that's why our infrastructure is second to none in the world around the financiers, the engineers, the drillers, the geologists. They're all here in BC and in Canada, and that's what makes us competitive across the world. The second thing that I'd like to take away from this is, as to your point, the fact that now they've bifurcated the critical minerals exploration tax credit and made it a separate and bigger tax credit, which is 30% versus the regular minerals exploration tax credit of 15%, is hugely indicative of what I've been espousing over the last little while, sure, which is the ship has sailed. Policy has now been enacted. Policy is now moving. Everyone is talking about the decarbonization by 2050, electrification, et cetera, et cetera. They've now validated my claim that copper is one of the essential critical minerals to make this happen. It's in fact the critical mineral to make this happen. So the additional tax credit that's provided through this budget is strictly focusing on these types of critical elements. So you have to actually prove that you are looking for copper, and that's easy for us because 64% of our asset base or our deposit by revenue is copper, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah. I think that this is a fantastic movement for not only ourselves, but everybody in the industry in Canada. I think it makes us tremendously competitive. It perhaps brings us back to being top 3 in the world, right. Which I don't see why we shouldn't be, given that we should be viewed, and I think we are starting to be viewed as leaders in the world as it relates to how to tackle these new issues and new themes around social license, sustainability, and the environment.
Important themes.
Very important.
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
know that there is a task force in British Columbia, economic task force that is driven by the BC government, where they're selecting a few companies, including ourselves, to go on the road and to espouse the virtues of investing in British Columbia. British Columbia being obviously a stable jurisdiction with strong rule of law, with a very transparent permitting process. Yes, it takes a little bit longer to permit in British Columbia, but the way I view it, once you have it, it's assurance that the project is going to go ahead as planned.
It's a really good point.
Yep.
Yeah. Let's finish off by going back to Northisle Copper and Gold. Tell me a bit about where you guys see yourselves finishing off in 2022. You got any financings coming down the pipeline? Any news releases? You obviously can't tell us what they're going to be, but do you have any kind of news pending, drill activities? Like, give us a little bit of sense of what's going to happen the rest of this year that you sort of foresee.
Sure, absolutely. So right now, as I mentioned before, one of our main priorities from an exploration perspective is to find this 40 to 50 million ton resource at Northwest Expo. That's an incremental resource that currently doesn't exist in our resource base today. The second priority for us is to get out our drilling from 2021. So assays are still pending. Everyone knows the issues and trials and tribulations that people are going through with assay labs. We still have our 2021 and our initiated 2022 program coming from Hushima.
Okay.
So that's something that people should hopefully see shortly. The third priority for us is to understand the net effect of this incremental 40 to 50 million tons around our current project. Can we make it an extension? Right now, as I said, we've got 100,000 ounces of production, of recoverable production a year, and 100 million pounds of copper production a year for 22 years as defined by the PEA. What does this incremental amount of 40 to 50 million tons do from the gold and copper perspective? The fourth is actually metallurgy. Metallurgy is very important. So this is a very typical copper gold porphyry system, very similar to what we saw at BHP's Island Copper Mine. The recoveries on the copper is beautiful. It reports into a chalcopyrite. The gold reports into the pyrite, but on the peripheral of the pyrite. So right now, think about the recoveries on the gold are not great. The 100,000 ounces go to our account and 100,000 ounces go to ore waste. And so we know we could improve on that because we've seen historical suggestions through obviously BHP's program and through our met test work that indicates that we don't have to throw half of our gold away. So that's something that we're advancing immediately as well. And I think it's going to have a huge effect. And then last but certainly not least, I think that there is a lot of talk certainly about good relationships and formations of partnerships with our First Nation communities, and I believe that they're as strong as I've represented them. We are looking to formalize that in some form of an agreement that perhaps bridges that to an IBA sometime in the future.
What's an IBA?
IBA is an impact benefits agreement.
Okay.
And so this would be the bridge to that. What it would do is enable us to obviously have their public support for the project in concept, give them the ability and the capacity to assess the project at a very early stage, such that once we get down to the road where we're actually looking to permit this in 2 years after our environmental baseline studies, we will have agreement that this is the project that we've defined together, and that's reasonable for all parties, and including our First Nations partners. So that's something that I think is going to be hugely impactful as it relates to people's perception of our ability to move the project forward with our First Nations support.
Sam, it's obvious you're very excited about copper. You talked earlier about how copper is more useful than gold.
Yep.
You made that reference to pulling gold out of the ground to put back into the ground. Do you think we would ever see an Olympics where first place is a copper medal?
So will the copper ever exceed 1850 per ounce? Probably not. If they do, it's probably not going to be the metal used for electrification anymore.
Well, I'm really excited for you. Sam Lee, President and CEO of Northisle Copper and Gold, looking to lead the way to maybe Vancouver Island's next big copper project. I'm very excited for you, Sam. Nice to see you in here at Coastal Front. Thanks for being on our show today.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I really enjoyed this.
That's great. Thanks.
Cheers.